I walked through the front door of the house I grew up in, still wearing my black funeral dress, still carrying the single white rose I had brought to my father's graveside that morning. I had just spent 2 hours standing in the rain watching them lower the most important man in my life into the cold Georgia ground. My hands were numb. My chest felt like someone had replaced my lungs with concrete. And all I wanted in the entire world was to sit down in my father's old armchair, wrap myself in his wool blanket, and cry until I had nothing left. What I got instead was the sound of my stepmother's voice drifting from the kitchen, low and sharp and completely stripped of the grief she had been performing all week at the funeral home. I stopped in the hallway, one hand still on the front door handle. My stepbrother's voice cut in over hers, impatient and excited in a way that made my stomach turn. "I told you," he was saying. "The old man never updated the operating agreement after the refinance. That means the LLC structure is still in my name as co-manager. She does not have a clear majority claim without a court fight. And a court fight takes money she does not have." My stepmother laughed quietly. A cold, satisfied sound I had never once heard from her during the 3 days of the wake. "She will be so lost in her grief she will not even read what she is signing. You know how she gets when she is emotional. She shuts completely down." I stood completely still in the hallway of my father's house, still holding my white rose, and listened to my stepmother and my stepbrother plan exactly how they intended to steal everything my father had spent his entire life building. "My name is Claire. I am 31 years old. I am a licensed CPA and a certified estate planning paralegal. I have spent the last 6 years of my career helping families protect their assets from exactly the kind of people who were sitting in my father's kitchen right now. My father, Robert, died 8 days ago from a stroke. He was 64 years old. He had built a mid-size residential construction company from the ground up over 30 years, a company currently valued at just over $4 million. He had owned the family home outright since my mother passed when I was 12. He had been meticulous, organized, and fiercely protective of the legacy he intended to leave me. He had married my stepmother, Diane, 6 years ago. She was warm enough in the beginning, pleasant at holidays, polite to my face. Her son Marcus had come as part of the package, 33 years old, loud-mouthed, and perpetually in some kind of financial trouble. My father had taken a liking to Marcus, gave him a manager title at the construction company to appease Diane, and let him sit on a salary he had never once earned. I had watched Marcus closely for 6 years. And 9 months ago, when my father's health began to decline and the doctors started using words like progressive and irreversible, I had sat down with my father in this exact house and had a very long, very thorough conversation about what came next. I knew every document. I knew every account. I knew every single thing my father owned and exactly who it was supposed to go to. I also knew that the people sitting in that kitchen had absolutely no idea how much I knew. So I did the only rational thing a CPA who has spent 6 years in estate law can do when she discovers she is standing in the middle of a carefully laid trap. I loosened my grip on the front door handle, set my white rose down quietly on the entry table, and I walked into the kitchen, wearing the most devastated expression I had ever performed in my life. Diane was the first to react. She turned from the counter, and the cold satisfaction on her face vanished in less than half a second, replaced by a mask of maternal warmth so practiced it would have fooled almost anyone. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a hug that felt like being embraced by a mannequin. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, rubbing my back in slow circles. "You must be absolutely exhausted. Come sit down." Marcus made coffee. Marcus was leaning against the far counter with his arms crossed, watching me over the rim of his mug. He had the particular expression of someone who is trying very hard to look sympathetic while actually running numbers in their head. He gave me a slow, somber nod. "Rough day," he said. The understatement of the century. I sat down at the kitchen table and let Diane bring me a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. I kept my shoulders curved inward. I kept my eyes slightly unfocused. I had spent enough time around grieving families in my professional life to know exactly what genuine shock looked like, and I used every bit of that knowledge to construct an impenetrable performance. Marcus sat down across from me. He waited exactly 4 minutes before he started talking. He began gently, the way someone does when they have rehearsed the conversation in advance. He said he had been looking through some of the company records over the past few days, just to help out, just to get ahead of things so I would not have to worry. He said he had found some inconsistencies. He said he was concerned. I looked up at him with wide, tired eyes. What kind of inconsistencies? He sighed heavily, like a man carrying a burden too great for one person. He said that my father had restructured the LLC 2 years ago. He said that during the restructuring, the operating agreement had accidentally left Marcus listed as a co-managing member with equal authority. He said that because of this, any major decisions about the company, including selling it, refinancing it, or distributing its assets legally, required his signature alongside mine. He reached into the leather bag sitting beside his chair and pulled out a thick folder. I had his attorney look it over, Marcus said, sliding the folder across the table toward me. It is all in there. I want to make sure we handle this the right way, Claire. For Dad's sake. I pulled the folder toward me slowly. I opened it with trembling hands. The document inside was impressively formatted. Someone had put real effort into it. The LLC operating agreement was printed on heavy paper with a professional letterhead. My father's name appeared in several places. His signature appeared at the bottom of the last page. It was a forgery. I knew it immediately, not because I could detect the signature at a glance, but because I had personally reviewed my father's actual operating agreement 4 months ago. I had read every line. I had a certified copy in my own files. Marcus was listed as a salaried manager with zero ownership and zero decision-making authority. My father had been extraordinarily clear about that. But the people sitting at this kitchen table did not know that I knew. I pressed my fingers to my lips, letting my eyes fill with the kind of helpless confusion that grief can genuinely produce. I don't understand, I said quietly. Dad never mentioned any of this. Diane reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. That is exactly why we wanted to talk to you right away, she said. Before you made any decisions. Before any of the lawyers got involved and made things complicated. We just want to protect you. Marcus nodded. He wanted to handle everything. He said he could manage the company transition quietly, without a messy legal process, and make sure I received what was fair. He said the word fair with the practiced confidence of a man who has decided what fair means entirely on his own. He slid a second document across the table. This one was a transfer agreement, giving him temporary management control of the company for a period of 12 months while the estate settled. Just a formality, he said. To keep the business running smoothly while everything gets sorted out. You do not want the crews sitting idle, do you? The contracts will lapse. I stared at the paper. I could feel Diane watching my face carefully, reading me, trying to determine how deep the grief went and whether it was deep enough to make me stop thinking. I picked up the pen he had placed next to the document. My hand shook. I let it shake. I brought the tip of the pen to the signature line, and then I set the pen down. I just need a minute, I whispered, pressing both hands flat on the table. I am sorry. I just need a minute to breathe. Diane immediately softened her grip on my hand. Of course, she said warmly. Take all the time you need. We are not going anywhere. They were not going anywhere. That was exactly right. What they did not know was that 4 months ago, sitting at the kitchen table of this exact house, my father and I had designed something together. It started as a conversation about estate planning and turned into something much more deliberate. My father had been sharp until almost the very end, and he had understood completely when I explained it to him. We had pre-registered a specific version of my signature with the estate attorney. Not a forged version, a documented version. A variant with a particular loop in the capital C and a break in the L that I could reproduce on demand. It was catalogued with the attorney's office as a distress indicator. If my signature ever appeared on any estate document using that specific variant, it automatically triggered an attorney review and rendered the document legally unenforceable. We had also done one more thing. 3 months ago, when Marcus had started making little comments about the company, asking questions he had no business asking, I had gone to my father's office and installed a small, encrypted audio recorder inside the base of the desk lamp, perfectly legal in the state of Georgia. I had changed the memory card twice. I had been collecting audio for 92 days. I picked the pen back up. I placed the tip against the signature line. I curved the C with the specific loop. I broke the L exactly as documented. I signed every page Marcus put in front of me with the calm, mechanical precision of someone signing away her inheritance, and with the absolute cold satisfaction of someone planting a minefield. Marcus picked up the signed pages and tapped them against the table to straighten them. The smile he allowed himself was brief, but I caught it. It was the smile of a man who has just won something. "You are doing the right thing," Diane said gently, patting my hand one final time before standing up. "Your father would be proud of you for being so practical." My father would have laughed until he cried. They stayed for another hour. They ate the food that the neighbors had brought over and spoke warmly about my father's legacy and what a wonderful man he had been. They were gracious and generous, and completely unaware that I had spent the entire hour composing a text message to the estate attorney from my phone under the kitchen table. When they finally left, I stood at the front window and watched Marcus load the signed documents into the back seat of his car with the careful handling of a man transporting something valuable. Diane climbed into the passenger seat without looking back at the house. They drove away down the quiet suburban street, and I waited until their taillights disappeared around the corner before I allowed my posture to change. I walked to the kitchen, poured the untouched coffee down the drain, and called the estate attorney directly. He answered on the second ring. His name was Mr. Ellison. He had handled my father's estate planning for 11 years and had been my professional contact for the past 6 months of preparation. He already knew the shape of what might be coming. The distress signature was used, I told him, on a forged operating agreement and a management transfer document. Marcus is claiming co-managing authority through a falsified LLC restructuring. Mr. Ellison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will file the fraud flag with the probate court first thing tomorrow morning. The documents are automatically void. What else do you need?" "I need you to pull every financial record associated with the company LLC for the past 2 years," I said, walking down the hall to my father's office. "I need every transaction Marcus touched. And I need the probate hearing scheduled as soon as possible." I turned on the desk lamp and looked at the small recorder sitting in its base. "I also have audio," I told Mr. Ellison. There was a pause. Then he said quietly, "Claire, I think they significantly underestimated you." "You have no idea," I said. The next 3 days were a particular kind of quiet war. Marcus moved fast. The morning after the funeral, he showed up at my father's construction yard and introduced himself to the site foreman as the acting managing director, waving the transfer documents with the confidence of a man who has never once faced a real consequence. 2 of the crew supervisors called me within the hour, confused and asking for confirmation. I told them to go home for the day and that I would handle it. Marcus sent me a text that evening that read simply, "The transition is underway. I will keep you updated," like he was doing me a favor. I did not respond. Diane called twice. The first call, she was warm and gentle, asking how I was holding up, reminding me that Marcus was only trying to protect the business. The second call, 2 days later, she dropped the warmth entirely. Her voice was flat and pointed. She said she hoped I was not planning to cause problems. She said the paperwork was filed and the attorneys were involved now and that making a scene would only hurt me in the end. She said my father had always worried about my tendency to be difficult. I listened to the whole call without saying a word. Then I said I understood, thanked her, and hung up. What Diane did not know was that her second call came in while I was sitting across the desk from a financial crimes investigator at the Georgia Secretary of State's office. I had submitted a formal complaint 2 days prior, along with a certified copy of the real operating agreement, the forgery, a side-by-side signature analysis, and a 22-page financial audit. I had completed myself of every transaction Marcus had run through the company accounts over the past 18 months. What I had found in those 18 months was far worse than a forged signature. Marcus had been billing the construction company for subcontractor invoices from an LLC registered in his own name in Alabama. He had run $140,000 through that shell company over 14 months, inflating project costs on 3 separate residential contracts, pocketing the difference, and covering it with paperwork convincing enough to fool anyone who was not specifically looking for it. He had been stealing from my father for over a year. My father, who had given him a title and a salary and a seat at the table out of nothing but love for a woman who did not deserve it. I compiled every document, every transaction record, and every fraudulent invoice into a single indexed file and delivered it to Mr. Ellison, the investigator at the Secretary of State's office, and the probate court clerk in the same afternoon. Then I went home and I let myself cry for the first time since my father died. I sat in his armchair with his wool blanket and I cried until I had nothing left, because I had been holding it since the moment I walked through that front door and heard my stepbrother's voice in the kitchen, and grief does not wait forever. When I was done, I washed my face, made a pot of tea, and prepared for the probate hearing. The morning of the probate hearing arrived gray and cold, the kind of late October morning that makes Atlanta feel briefly like somewhere up north. I drove downtown and parked in the courthouse garage and sat in my car for exactly 5 minutes. I was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, my hair pulled back cleanly, my briefcase sitting on the passenger seat with everything inside it organized and tabbed. I had slept well. I had eaten breakfast. I was entirely ready. When I walked into the courthouse hallway outside the assigned hearing room, I saw them immediately. Diane was wearing a new black dress and pearl earrings, projecting the image of a respectable widow with everything to protect and nothing to hide. She had her hands folded neatly in front of her, and her chin lifted slightly, the posture of a woman who believes she is the most credible person in the room. Marcus was standing next to her in a dark suit, looking polished and self-assured, holding his leather bag against his side. Beside them stood a heavy-set man in an expensive tie whom I did not recognize but who had the air of a hired attorney who charges by the hour and asks questions later. There was also a fourth person, a small, precise-looking man carrying a clipboard, standing slightly apart from the group. I recognized the type immediately. An independent business valuator, likely brought in by Marcus to establish his claim to a share of the company's assessed worth. They had come fully prepared to win. When Marcus saw me walking down the corridor alone, something shifted briefly in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, there and gone in less than a second. He recovered quickly and gave me a slow, controlled nod that was meant to communicate pity. I nodded back and walked past them into the hearing room. The room was small and wood-paneled, with a single long table and a raised bench at the front. The probate judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific patience of someone who has heard every variation of family argument that money can produce. Her name was Judge Weston. Mr. Ellison was already seated at the respondent's table, 2 neat stacks of documents in front of him. Marcus's attorney, whose name turned out to be Mr. Pratt, launched the opening statement with the smooth authority of someone billing $400 an hour. He explained that Marcus had served as co-managing member of the company LLC under a properly filed operating agreement. He said my father had specifically included Marcus in a leadership capacity because he trusted his business judgment and wanted continuity for the company after his death. He explained that the estate was disputing this arrangement out of grief and family tension, and that the court needed to recognize the binding legal documents that had been duly signed and submitted. He spoke about my father with the familiarity of someone who had never met him, attributing motivations to a dead man who could not contradict them. He made Marcus sound generous and long-suffering. He made me sound unstable. Then he called Diane to speak as a supporting witness. Diane sat in the chair beside the table and spoke about her marriage to my father with genuine-sounding warmth. She described him as devoted and practical, a man who had wanted his family protected. She said he had spoken to her many times about making sure Marcus had a stable role in the company. She said he had worried about me, worried that I carried too much on my own, that I was the kind of person who refused help even when I needed it. She looked at me once during this part, directly and briefly, with an expression that was equal parts compassion and steel. It was a breathtaking performance. Mr. Ellison waited. He was very good at waiting. When Judge Weston turned to the respondent's side and asked if we had anything to present, Mr. Ellison stood and said simply that we did, and that we would like to begin with the operating agreement. He submitted the certified original, filed 11 years ago and updated once, not twice, with my father's estate attorney, with no mention of Marcus in any capacity beyond salaried manager. He placed it next to the version Marcus had submitted, side by side. He pointed out 17 specific formatting inconsistencies between the two documents. He submitted the signature analysis from a certified forensic document examiner who had determined with 94% confidence that the signature on the Marcus version was a careful tracing rather than an original mark. Judge Weston looked at the two documents for a long time. She looked at Marcus over the top of her reading glasses. Mr. Pratt started to object, and she held up one hand without looking at him. Continue, she said to Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison submitted the financial audit. He walked through the Alabama LLC, the shell invoices, the $140,000 in fraudulent billing. He submitted the bank records. He submitted the invoice comparisons. He submitted the registration documents for the Alabama company, which had been filed under Marcus's name and a home address that corresponded to his mother's house in Savannah. He was stealing from his own stepfather, Mr. Ellison said quietly, for at least 14 months before Robert's death. Diane made a small sound. She pressed one hand flat against the table. Marcus had gone very still. His attorney leaned over and whispered something directly into his ear. Marcus shook his head once, sharply, and stared straight ahead. Then Mr. Ellison said he had one more item to submit, and he looked at me. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the small digital recorder. I placed it on the table in front of the judge's clerk. "This is an audio recording," I said, my voice steady and clear, collected from a device legally installed in my father's private office in the family home. It contains 47 minutes of recorded conversation between Marcus and Diane, captured over 3 separate sessions. The most relevant portions have been time-stamped and transcribed. I pressed play. The first voice was Marcus's, clear as anything, recorded 2 months before my father died, explaining to Diane how the operating agreement could be altered after the fact because the filing office barely checked for changes on established LLCs. He used the phrase, "She will never look that closely." He explained that as long as they moved fast in the days right after the funeral, before I had time to organize anything, they could establish his authority before I even thought to question it. The second clip was from 6 weeks ago, a week after my father's first hospitalization. Marcus explaining the shell company structure in the kind of detail that only someone deeply comfortable with their own scheme uses. He named the Alabama LLC. He named the amount. He described how he had been running it for over a year, and my father had never once caught it because the invoices were attached to real project files, and Robert trusted him. He actually used the word trusted. The third clip was from the day after the funeral. The voices were both of them, in my father's own kitchen, while I was standing in the hallway holding a white rose. The courtroom was silent in a way that had weight to it. Judge Weston set down her pen. She looked from Marcus to Diane and back again with an expression that was entirely devoid of any sympathy whatsoever. She said she had seen a great many probate disputes over the course of her career. She said she had rarely seen one in which the petitioners had arrived in her courtroom, having already provided her with their own evidence of felony fraud. She dismissed Marcus's claim to the operating agreement completely. She voided the management transfer documents. She confirmed the estate as mine, in full, without condition. Then she said she was referring both the forged documents and the financial audit to the district attorney's office for criminal review. She looked at Marcus's attorney and told him he might want to have a conversation with his client before they left the building. Marcus sat completely motionless as she said all of this. He had the particular stillness of someone whose brain is working very hard to locate an exit that does not exist. Diane turned and looked at him. She had been looking at him with the expression of a woman calculating survival odds since the first audio clip finished playing. I recognized the moment she decided that he was a liability, because it was the same moment my stepmother stopped being his co-conspirator and became someone trying to save herself. She turned slightly away from him in her chair, just a fraction of an inch, the way people do when they are physically distancing themselves from someone who is about to fall. Marcus noticed it too. He looked at her and something in his face broke open, briefly, before he closed it back down. Mr. Ellison gathered his documents. The hearing was over in 40 minutes. I walked out of that courtroom into the cold October hallway and stood by the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the city below. The sky had cleared while we were inside and there was actual sunlight on the buildings now, flat and clean and bright. Behind me I could hear Mr. Pratt speaking in a low, urgent voice. I could hear Marcus saying something once that was not quite a full sentence. I did not turn around. Mr. Ellison appeared at my shoulder. He said quietly that we had done everything correctly, that the estate would transfer cleanly, that the criminal referral would take time, but that the audit we had provided was thorough enough to make the outcome fairly predictable. I told him thank you. I told him I had learned from the best, meaning my father. And he smiled because he had known my father for 11 years and understood what that meant. The months that followed moved with the particular slow clarity of a life being rebuilt from a solid foundation. The construction company remained intact. I took a 6-week leave from my firm to step into the day-to-day operations while a permanent general manager was hired. The crew, the same men who had called me confused from the job site the day Marcus showed up waving his fake papers, turned out to be exactly the kind of people my father had always described: loyal, skilled, and entirely relieved to have someone in charge who knew what they were doing. Marcus was formally charged with 6 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of document forgery 4 months after the hearing. He hired a private defense attorney with money I strongly suspect came from Diane, which is a problem that will eventually become her problem. His arraignment was covered by the local business news in a small paragraph on an inside page. His Alabama LLC was dissolved by the state. His reputation in whatever professional circles he had been operating in quietly evaporated. Diane did not face criminal charges. There was not enough on the recordings to prove she had direct knowledge of the fraudulent billing, only that she knew about the plan to forge the operating agreement. Her attorney negotiated her cooperation with the DA in exchange for her testimony. She moved back to Savannah shortly after. She sent me one email, long and self-justifying, explaining that she had been trying to protect her son and that she hoped I could understand a mother's instinct someday. I read it once, closed it, and did not reply. I sold the family home. It was the hardest single decision I made in all of it. Harder in some ways than the hearing itself, because the house was full of my father and my mother and 20 years of everything that mattered. But I understood that what made those things real was not the walls around them. I kept the armchair. I kept the wool blanket. I packed his framed photographs and his old blueprint notebooks and everything of his that could be carried, and I let the house go to a young family who walked through it on the first showing and stood in the backyard and looked at each other the way people do when they already know. I moved into a renovated apartment downtown, close to the firm, close to the job sites, close to everything I needed to build what came next. On a Tuesday evening, about 7 months after the hearing, I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a contract when my phone lit up with a notification from a legal tracker I had set up on Marcus's case. He had entered a guilty plea that afternoon on 3 of the 6 fraud counts. The sentencing was scheduled for the following month. I set the phone down and sat quietly for a moment with my hands folded on the table. My father was a methodical man. He had kept records of everything. He had updated his will twice in the last 2 years of his life, making sure every account, every asset, every piece of the business was documented and assigned and protected. He had done it quietly, without drama, without ever once telling me directly that he was afraid of what might happen, because he was not the kind of man who spoke his fears out loud. He just built walls against them. When I had sat with him at this kitchen table, 9 months before he died, and laid out the whole plan, the distress signature, the recorder, the audit trail, he had listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I was done, he had looked at me for a long moment and said, "I raised you exactly right." I think about that a lot. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive all at once at the graveside in the rain. It arrives in the small moments, in the instinct to call someone who cannot answer, in the habit of saving a story to tell a person who is no longer there to hear it. I live with that grief every day, and I expect I will for the rest of my life. And I have made peace with that, because grief of that kind is just love, with nowhere to go, and I have more than enough love left for my father to carry it indefinitely. What I do not carry, not for a single day, is guilt about what happened in that courthouse. I do not carry regret about the recordings or the audit or the distress signature or any of the decisions I made in the weeks after the funeral. They came into my father's home on the day we buried him, and they tried to take everything he had worked for his entire life. They looked at his grieving daughter and saw an opportunity. They did not know who they were looking at. If you have ever had to protect what is yours from the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know something. The calmest decision you will ever make is the one to stop being the person they have always assumed you are. You do not have to scream. You do not have to beg. You just have to know more than they think you know. Wait longer than they think you can wait. And trust the work you have already done. The trash will take itself out. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Recovery Stories. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? I want to hear from you.